Margaret Chen had always believed that dying alone was her greatest fear, but as she lay in the sterile hospital room on a Tuesday morning in March, she realized she had been wrong. The silence wasn't the worst part. It was the weight of all the connections she had never made, all the conversations she had avoided, all the walls she had built around herself over 73 years of careful, cautious living. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Rodriguez delivered the news that would change everything. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 3 to 6 weeks. The word seemed to echo in the empty room, bouncing off walls that had seen countless similar conversations, countless other people receiving news that would reshape their remaining time on Earth. Margaret nodded politely, thanked the doctor, and waited for him to leave before allowing herself to cry. Not the dramatic tears of movie scenes, but the quiet, steady kind that spoke of a lifetime of holding everything inside. She had no emergency contact listed. No family to call. Her address book contained only service providers, doctors, and the occasional neighbor she exchanged pleasantries with in the hallway of her apartment building. She had moved to Portland 3 years earlier after retiring from her job as a librarian in a small town where she had lived for 40 years. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to finally live the life she had always imagined for herself. Instead, she found herself more isolated than ever, lost in a city full of people who seemed to know exactly where they belonged while she remained on the outside looking in. The first week in the hospital passed in a blur of medical procedures and visits from kind but professional staff. Margaret watched through her window as spring began to emerge in the courtyard below. Cherry trees bloomed in delicate pink clusters, and she found herself wondering if she would see them again next year, already knowing the answer. It was during her second week that something unexpected happened. A young nurse named David was helping her to the bathroom when she stumbled slightly, her strength failing more each day. As he steadied her, she whispered an apology for being such a burden. David stopped walking and looked at her with genuine surprise. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, "you could never be a burden. Taking care of people like you is why I became a nurse. You remind me of my grandmother, who taught me that every person has stories worth hearing, even if they've never had anyone to tell them to." Something in his voice broke through the wall Margaret had spent decades building. That evening, when David stopped by to check her vitals, she found herself telling him about the library where she had worked, about the children who would come in after school and how she would secretly set aside new books she thought they might like. She told him about the poetry she used to write in college, hidden in journals she still kept but never shared with anyone. David listened with the kind of attention that made Margaret feel truly seen for the first time in years. When he left that night, he did something that would set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. He went home and wrote a post on a community message board for Portland residents, not mentioning Margaret's name but simply sharing that he had met someone who had spent her life caring for others and was now facing her final weeks alone. He asked if anyone might be interested in sending a card or a kind message to someone who could use a reminder that her life had mattered. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, David's inbox was flooded with messages from people who wanted to help. Teachers, parents, students, retirees, and working professionals all reached out, asking for more details about how they could bring some comfort to a stranger in her final days. Margaret knew nothing of this growing movement until the cards began arriving. The first one came on a Thursday morning, delivered by a volunteer from the hospital who explained that it had been sent by someone who simply wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Margaret opened it with shaking hands to find a watercolor painting of cherry blossoms and a note from a local artist named Sarah who wrote that she hoped the beauty of spring would bring Margaret some peace. By Friday, there were 12 more cards. By Monday, the number had grown to nearly 50. Each one was personal, thoughtful, and filled with the kind of genuine warmth that Margaret had convinced herself existed only in movies and books. There were drawings from elementary school children who had heard about her from their teacher. There were photographs of gardens from elderly residents of other care facilities who understood the loneliness she was facing. There were poems written by teenagers, recipes from grandmothers, and stories from people who had been touched by librarians in their own lives. But the cards were only the beginning. Word of Margaret's story had begun to spread through Portland's interconnected community networks. Coffee shop regulars mentioned it to their baristas. Neighbors shared it at community meetings. Teachers told their students, who told their parents, who told their coworkers. Without anyone planning or organizing it, a movement began to form around bringing comfort to one dying woman who had spent her life quietly caring for others. The first visitor was unexpected. Margaret looked up from reading a card to find a woman in her 40s standing in her doorway, holding a small potted orchid. She introduced herself as Linda, a fellow librarian who had heard Margaret's story through the network of library professionals in the city. She had come not out of pity, but out of recognition of a shared calling and a deep respect for the quiet work Margaret had done throughout her career. Linda stayed for an hour, and their conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of people who understood each other's world. They talked about favorite books, difficult patrons, and the special magic that happened when the right book found the right person at exactly the right moment. When Linda left, she promised to return, and she kept that promise, visiting Margaret every few days and bringing with her stories from the library where she worked and updates on programs Margaret had helped inspire. Soon, other visitors began arriving. David had created a simple sign-up system for people who wanted to visit, ensuring that Margaret would never be overwhelmed but would always have company if she wanted it. There was Marcus, a high school student who came to read poetry aloud because he had heard that Margaret loved literature. There was Elena, a retired teacher who brought photo albums of students she had taught over the years, sharing stories of how libraries had changed their lives. There was Robert, a widower who understood the weight of loneliness and came simply to sit quietly with Margaret when words weren't needed. Each visitor brought something unique, but they all brought the same gift, the gift of seeing Margaret as a whole person with a life worth celebrating, not just as a patient waiting to die. They listened to her stories about growing up as the daughter of immigrants, about her parents' sacrifice to give her an education, about the books that had shaped her worldview, and about the small moments of connection that had sustained her through decades of quiet service. As the third week arrived, Margaret's strength was noticeably fading, but her spirits had been transformed. Her room had become a gallery of artwork, photographs, and cards from people across Portland. The windowsill was lined with small plants and flowers that visitors had brought. A bulletin board was covered with drawings from children, and a small table held books that people had gifted her, many with personal inscriptions explaining why that particular story had meant something to them. The transformation wasn't just in Margaret's environment, it was in Margaret herself. The woman who had spent her life believing she was forgettable had discovered that she was deeply memorable to people she had never even met. The person who had convinced herself that she was meant to go through life alone had found herself surrounded by a community that had formed around her simply because she existed and her life had value. During her final week, something extraordinary happened that none of the organizers could have planned. The number of people who wanted to visit or send cards had grown beyond what anyone had imagined. David, who had started this chain of kindness with a simple post, realized that they now had over 200 people who were part of Margaret's extended community of care. Teachers were bringing their entire classes to make cards. Senior centers were organizing group visits. Local businesses were donating flowers, books, and gifts. On Margaret's final Wednesday, her room couldn't hold all the visitors who came to see her. The hospital staff, moved by what they were witnessing, arranged for people to gather in the courtyard below her window. Margaret, propped up in bed with pillows, looked down to see nearly 50 people who had come just to wave and show their support. They held signs with messages of love, they sang songs, and they stood witness to the life of someone they had come to care about deeply. Margaret pressed her hand against the window, tears streaming down her face, but these were different tears than the ones she had cried weeks earlier. These were tears of overwhelming gratitude and amazement at the capacity for human kindness that had surrounded her in her darkest hour. That evening, as Margaret rested peacefully surrounded by cards, flowers, and the lingering warmth of dozens of conversations and connections, David sat with her and marveled at what had unfolded. A simple act of compassion, a willingness to see someone's worth and share that recognition with others, had created something beautiful and powerful that none of them could have imagined. Margaret passed away peacefully 3 days later, but her story was far from over. The community that had formed around her continued to meet, inspired by what they had experienced together. They started a program at local libraries to visit elderly patrons who might be isolated. They created a card-writing group that sent encouragement to other hospital patients. They established a fund to bring books and art supplies to people in hospice care. Most importantly, they carried forward the lesson that Margaret had taught them without even knowing she was teaching it, that every life has value, that no one should face their hardest moments alone, and that the simple act of seeing and acknowledging another person's worth can create ripples of kindness that extend far beyond anything we can imagine. The cherry trees in the hospital courtyard bloomed again the following spring, and many of the people who had been part of Margaret's community returned to stand beneath them and remember the woman who had shown them the extraordinary power of ordinary human connection. Margaret Chen had lived her life believing she was invisible, but in her final weeks, she discovered something profound: she had always been visible to the hearts that were ready to see her. And in seeing her, nearly 200 strangers had not only given her the gift of connection in her final days but had given themselves the gift of understanding what it truly means to be part of a community bound together by compassion. Her story reminds us that kindness is not a grand gesture reserved for special occasions. It's the daily choice to see the worth in every person we encounter, to reach out when someone needs connection, and to remember that we all have the power to ensure that no one has to face life's most difficult moments alone. If Margaret's story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might be inspired by this reminder of how much difference we can make in each other's lives. Subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories to hear more accounts of ordinary people doing extraordinary things through simple acts of compassion. And perhaps most importantly, look around your own community for the Margaret Chens who might be waiting for someone to simply see them and recognize the value of their story. Because in a world that can sometimes feel disconnected and harsh, each of us has the power to create the kind of community that ensures no one dies alone, and everyone lives knowing they matter.